what Russia is trying to achieve here. What is the Russian objective? Is it to take over Ukraine? Is it to absorb some of Ukraine into its state? Is it to run a sort of Soviet satellite state there? What are they looking to do?
Well, you've heard President Zelensky referred to just now by Philip Ingram and his inspirational leadership. He says that Russia actually wants to erase Ukraine as a country and as a people. And that's actually not far off what President Putin seems to have laid out in all of his manifestos and all of his aims for this war and the next wars, which he thinks are going to come after that. He's talking about how Ukraine doesn't have the right to exist as a nation, was a fiction, was an invention. There's no such thing as a separate Ukrainian people. So yes, it does seem pretty clear that the aim, at least in Putin's mind, is to reverse what he sees as the mistakes that allowed Ukraine to become independent in the first place. Now, the problem is, as we've already seen, Russia might have been overconfident, thinking that it might have won this war easily because it believed its own propaganda, because it believed that Ukraine would not resist, that its army would not put up a fight, that its people would not actually object to Russian soldiers among them. The challenge now, of course, is they haven't won the war the smart way, and they might revert to doing it the hard way, bludgeoning Ukraine into submission and presenting President Zelensky with impossible choices by shelling and by missile attacks on civilian areas to maximize the civilian suffering and try to blackmail him into surrendering.
Now, we know that the Russian army is an army of conscripts, even though those who fight on the front line, I believe, have to volunteer for that. The army itself is a conscripted one. For those watching on television now, we can see just how far that army has got through, making lots of progress in the south and the southeast of the country, but and encroaching there upon Kyiv, but they've sort of been stalled up there in the north for a little bit of time. So things are going to get really quite ugly quite quickly. Is this a sign of sort of desperation from the Russians, or was this always the plan, that they would start trying to almost win over the Ukrainian people, and if things didn't go that way, if they weren't welcomed in as liberators, then the real bloody warfare begins?
Well, I've seen it suggested in a lot of places, and I do find it quite plausible that perhaps the Russian leadership did genuinely underestimate Ukraine's status and the views of its people and as an independent nation and somewhere that would not welcome a Russian occupation. And again, Russia has form for this. There's a track record of failing to appreciate what they're sending their troops into, failing to appreciate that actually, no, people don't want Russian troops there. We've seen it before in Afghanistan, in Czechoslovakia in 1968, where Russia doesn't bother to appreciate and understand the human environment that it's sending its troops into. And the real test of that was if we look at their performance in Ukraine, where they worked extremely hard. In Syria, where they worked extremely hard to understand the human environment that they were going into and exploit it and work different factions against each other in order to achieve victories with less fighting. That's a huge contrast to what Russia does in its own neighborhood, where there's a certain amount of arrogance, thinking they already know it, so they don't need to do the research.